A king who could have any woman in Europe knelt in a darkened chapel at midnight and married a scarred, penniless widow 17 years older than his own mistress. No trumpets, no court, just two witnesses and a vow that would shake the throne of France forever. By 1680, Louis XIV was 39 years old and the most powerful man alive. Versailles glittered like a jewel box he had built with his bare will. Armies obeyed his nod, ambassadors trembled at his glance, and every night the most beautiful women in the kingdom paraded through the Hall of Mirrors, hoping for a smile. He had buried one queen, discarded one official mistress after another, and fathered so many illegitimate children that half the noble houses in France carried his blood in secret. Yet, in the spring of that year, the Sun King was quietly terrified. His queen, Maria Theresa, had died the previous year after a botched medical procedure. His beloved mistress, the dazzling Athénaïs de Montespan, had fallen from grace, her name tangled in the poison affair, whispers of black masses and infant blood circling the court like smoke. Louis had banished her from his bed, but the damage was done. He feared for his soul and for the legitimacy of the children she had given him. For the first time in his adult life, the king was alone at night. He still rose at 8, hunted until noon, ruled until evening, and danced until the candles burned low. But when the courtiers finally bowed themselves out and the palace fell silent, Louis wandered the marble corridors like a ghost. He began slipping into the private apartments of a woman no one expected him to notice, Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon, the former governess of his bastard children. She was 45, severe in black dresses, her face marked by childhood smallpox, her fortune modest, her reputation spotless. Courtiers laughed behind their fans. Maintenon, the king must be joking. She was the opposite of everything Versailles worshipped. No décolletage, no flirtation, no ambition on display. She spoke softly, quoted scripture, and refused gifts. When Louis sent her diamonds, she sent them back with a polite note. But the king kept coming. At first, it was a confession. He needed someone who would not lie to him. He told him about the terror that woke him at 3 a.m., the fear that God would punish France for his sins. She listened without flinching. Then it was conversation. He discovered she could talk about war, taxes, and architecture as easily as charity and salvation. Then it was comfort. He began staying longer, sometimes until dawn, sitting by her fire while she read to him or simply held his hand. The courtiers noticed the absences. Rumors flew. Duc de Saint-Simon wrote in his diary that the king seemed half bewitched. Younger beauties threw themselves at him harder. He barely saw them. When Montespan, furious at being replaced by a governess in mourning, burst into Maintenon's rooms to scream insults, Louis walked in, took Maintenon's side, and ordered his former mistress never to speak that way again. Something deeper than passion was growing, something the court had no name for: dependence. In the summer of 1683, tragedy struck again. The Queen's household was officially dissolved, and Louis's eldest legitimate son, the Dauphin, nearly died of fever. In his panic, the king turned to the one person who never flattered him. Maintenon nursed the prince day and night, then nursed the king's conscience. One evening, exhausted, Louis looked at her and said words no one ever expected from the mouth of the Sun King. "I cannot reign without you." She bowed her head and answered, "Then your majesty must marry me. Nothing less will silence the world and my own heart." Louis did not laugh. He did not rage. He simply stared into the fire for a very long time. What no one knew yet, what would remain the best-kept secret of the entire reign, was that before the year was out, in the dead of night, the King of France would kneel before a simple priest and make Françoise d'Aubigné his wife. Not a mistress, not a favorite,
a queen in all but name, crowned in darkness because the laws of France and the pride of the Bourbons would never allow it in daylight. And when that secret finally began to leak, it would threaten to bring down the entire edifice of Versailles.
Françoise d'Aubigné was born in a prison cell in 1635. Her father, a bankrupt swindler, was locked up for forgery. Her mother gave birth to her behind bars. By age 7, she was an orphan in everything but name, sent to the West Indies with an aunt, nearly sold into marriage at 12, then dragged back to France, penniless and half-wild. Beauty saved her the first time. A ruined poet named Paul Scarron, 43 and paralyzed, saw the ragged girl and offered a bargain. "Marry me, and you'll have a salon full of wits instead of a convent." She accepted. For 10 years she nursed him, learned to laugh at cruelty, and turned his crumbling house into the most brilliant literary circle in Paris. When Scarron died, he left her nothing but debts and a nickname, the beautiful Indian, from her years under the tropical sun. At 25, she was again destitute. Most women in her place would have become some nobleman's mistress. Françoise refused. She wore black, took a tiny pension from the Queen Mother, and waited. The second rescue came from a woman, Madame de Montespan, the king's dazzling, vicious mistress. Montespan had borne Louis child after child in secret, and needed someone discreet to raise them. She chose the pious widow with the spotless reputation. In 1669, Françoise entered the hidden apartment where the royal bastards lived. She bathed them, taught them prayers, and never breathed a word of their existence. Montespan mocked her as Saint Françoise and paid her almost nothing. Françoise smiled and stayed. She knew one truth the court forgot. Children grow up, and one day they talk to their father. By 1674, the eldest bastard, the Duc d'Umain, limped from a clubfoot and adored his governess. Louis visited, curious. He found a calm woman who never flattered him and who made his nervous son laugh. He came again and again. When Montespan's temper finally exploded and she struck the child in front of the king, Louis silently took the boy and the governess away forever. He bought Françoise a title, the lands of Maintenon, and a quiet apartment near his own. She was now 40, rich at last, and still untouchable. Courtiers waited for the king to seduce her. He tried once, gently. She refused him with such grace that he apologized. Instead of anger, he felt something new: respect. By 1680, she was the only person at Versailles who could tell the king no and keep her head. And she was about to become the only person he could not live without.
October 9th, 1683. Versailles slept under a thin autumn rain. At midnight, a side door of the palace opened without a sound. Louis XIV, dressed in plain gray, no wig, no jewels, stepped into the corridor, followed by only 3 people: the Archbishop of Paris, a single valet, and Françoise de Maintenon, wrapped in a black cloak. They walked in silence through back staircases the king himself had ordered built years earlier for escapes and secret loves. Tonight they served a different purpose. Down past the kitchens, past the sleeping guards, into a small chamber that had once been a queen's oratory. Candles guttered. A portable altar had been set up. 2 witnesses waited: the king's confessor, Père Lachaise, and his trusted minister, Louvois, both sworn to death-like silence. No music, no crown, no announcement would ever be made. The Archbishop, Harlay de Chanveillon, was pale. He knew he was breaking every law of France. A king could not marry a commoner. A twice-widowed woman could never be queen. If the princes of the blood ever discovered this, civil war could follow.
Yet Louis had commanded, and no one refused the Sun King. Françoise knelt first. Her hands did not shake. She had waited 48 years for a marriage made for love instead of survival, and she would not tremble now. Louis knelt beside her. At 45, he was still straight-backed and proud, but that night his voice cracked when he repeated the vows. He promised to honor and protect her all the days of my life. She promised obedience in the sight of God alone. Rings were exchanged. Plain gold bands bought in Paris under a false name. The entire ceremony lasted 12 minutes. When it was over, the archbishop kissed the king's hand and whispered, "Sire, you have just done the most dangerous thing of your reign." Louis answered simply, "I have just done the only thing that will let me sleep again." They returned the same way they came. By dawn, the portable altar had vanished. The priest was on his way to a remote abbey with a fat pension, and the two witnesses knew they would die before speaking. In the palace registers, the night was recorded as nothing remarkable. But everything had changed. From that night forward, Françoise occupied the apartment directly connected to the king's by a hidden door. She sat beside him at council meetings behind a screen. State papers began to carry her neat, firm handwriting in the margins. When foreign ambassadors were presented, they bowed toward an empty chair on the Queen's side, yet somehow felt another presence in the room. The court noticed the change in the king first. The rages stopped. The sleepless nights ended. He smiled more easily, hunted less cruelly, and when he spoke of Madame de Maintenon, his voice softened in a way it never had for Montespan or even for the dead queen. Only a handful of people guessed the truth, and they called her Madame de Maintenon behind their back, Mrs. Right Now, the Shadow Queen. They had no idea how completely she already ruled.
By 1685, the joke had died in every throat. No one dared call her Madame de Maintenon anymore. Courtiers who once mocked her black dresses now imitated them. When she entered a room, conversation dropped to a murmur and fans snapped shut. The woman who owned no crown had become the most powerful person in France after the king himself. Louis was 47 and beginning to feel it. The endless wars, the gout in his foot, the teeth that rotted one by one. Only in her apartments did he remove the mask. There, behind the hidden door, he became simply Louis, tired, sometimes frightened, and utterly dependent. He still made every final decision, but he no longer made them alone. Every evening at 10, the council ended, and the real government began. Papers were carried in by trusted valets. She read them first, underlined, annotated, and sometimes rewrote entire paragraphs. In the morning, the king signed what we had decided. The court watched in frozen horror. The old nobility hated her. She was common blood, a jailbird's daughter who now corrected their French and lectured them on morality. When the Duc de Saint-Simon's wife laughed too loudly at a comedy, Maintenon sent a note the next day. "Madam, the king dislikes noise." The Duchess never laughed again in public. The princes of the blood hated her more. Louis's brother, the Duc d'Orléans, flamboyant, bisexual, and furious, called her the old witch to her face at a family dinner. She looked at him calmly and replied, "Monseigneur, witches burn. Be careful you do not like the fire." 2 weeks later, his favorite mistress was exiled and his allowance cut. He never spoke the nickname again. Even the church was tamed. Jesuits who had once thundered against the king's adulteries now praised his exemplary piety. The reason was simple. Maintenon paid their bills and chose their bishops. When the Archbishop of Paris died in 1695, the post went to her former confessor. Rome protested. She wrote one letter, and Rome fell silent. Yet she never sat on the throne, never wore ermine, never signed a single document. Françoise, Queen of France. She refused the title, refused jewels, refused everything except power exercised in darkness. Her enemies called it hypocrisy. Her friends, and she had a few, called it genius. She only had one weakness, the children she had raised for Montespan. The Duc du Maine, brilliant and lame, was the son of her heart. She pushed Louis to legitimize him fully, to place him in the line of succession ahead of the Duc d'Orléans. In 1714, she almost succeeded. That ambition would one day cost her everything. For now, in the 1690s, France belonged to the secret couple. Wars were fought, palaces built, and heretics crushed, because a scarred woman in black said it was God's will, and the king believed her. Foreign courts tried to understand the mystery. The English ambassador wrote home, "The king has married his governess and governs with his nurse." The Spanish ambassador was blunter. "Louis XIV is dead. Long live Louis XIV and his wife." And still, almost nobody outside the inner circle knew they were married at all. The truth stayed locked behind that hidden door, guarded by two aging people who needed each other more than they needed the world. But secrets this large have a way of rotting from the inside. By 1715, the king lay dying, and the woman he had married in darkness prepared to face the storm she had always known would come, the day he closed his eyes.
September 1, 1715. Versailles stank of gangrene. For 9 days, Louis XIV had lain rotting alive, his left leg black to the thigh, the doctors cutting away pieces of him while he whispered psalms. Crowds packed the corridors, waiting for the end. In the Queen's empty bedchamber, Françoise de Maintenon, now 79, sat wrapped in black, motionless, except for her lips counting rosary beads. She had not left his side until the stench became unbearable even for her. Now she waited for permission to return. They would not let her. The Duc d'Orléans, next in line, had posted guards at the door. Courtiers who once kissed her hand now turned their backs. The old enemy, Montespan, was long dead, but her children, the legitimized bastards, stood with Orléans. They remembered every slight, every time the governess had pushed them aside for her precious Duc de Maine. On the morning of September 1, the king rallied one last time. He called for her. The guards hesitated. The old magic still worked. She walked the length of the Œil de Bœuf Gallery, while 300 people watched in silence. No one bowed. She found him shrunken, eyes huge, in a skull face. He took her hand, pressed it to his dry lips, and said clearly so the priests could hear, "My wife, do not leave me." Then he fell back and died. The room exploded into movement. Curtains ripped open, clocks stopped, courtiers running for carriages. In the chaos, no one noticed the old woman slip out by the hidden door one final time. She had exactly 4 hours. Servants, loyal since the midnight wedding, smuggled out chests of papers, letters in the king's own hand that proved everything. Her carriage was already loaded. At 4 in the afternoon, as the official death announcement boomed through the palace, Françoise de Maintenon left Versailles forever. She looked neither right nor left. The guards at the gate saluted out of habit, then realized who she was and let the swords drop too late. She went straight to Saint-Cyr, the girls' school she had founded 30 years earlier with the king's money. There she burned the most dangerous letters in her own fireplace, while the pupils watched in terror. Then she sat down to wait for the storm. It came the next day. Orléans, now regent, declared every act favoring the bastards void. The Duc de Maine was stripped of rank and thrown into the Bastille. Mobs roamed Paris, tearing down Maintenon portrait wherever they found it.
Pamphlets called her the black spider who had poisoned the rain. Someone tried to poison her well at Saint-Cyr. She drank only sealed wine after that. She never answered a single accusation. For 4 years, she lived quietly among her schoolgirls, teaching them Latin and embroidery, rising at 5 for Mass, refusing all visitors except the Spanish ambassador who came once to kneel and kiss her hand in the name of the Queen you truly were. She smiled, said nothing, and sent him away. On April 15, 1719, she caught a chill. The end was quick. Before she lost speech, she called the superior of Saint-Cyr and whispered, "Bury me simply. No inscription. Let God find me." They buried her at night on the chapel floor, under a plain stone with no name. Within weeks, the regent ordered the stone broken up and her body moved to an unmarked corner so that no one would ever pray at the grave of the secret queen. They needn't have bothered. France forgot her almost overnight. The century of lights began, wigs grew taller, morals loosened, and the woman who ruled from behind a screen became a footnote, a rumor, a ghost story told to children, the old witch who bewitched the Sun King. Only one man never forgot. In 1722, a young pupil at Saint-Cyr found an old sealed box hidden under the choir stalls. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Louis XIV's handwriting. "To my wife, my only wife, Françoise, in the sight of God. If the world denies you, heaven will not. Wait for me." The girl showed it to no one. She burned it in the same fireplace where the queen had once burned her secrets and kept the ashes in a locket until she died. The midnight marriage stayed secret after all. But somewhere beyond the reach of regents and revolutions, a king who once owned half of Europe still kneels in the dark, waiting for the scarred woman in black to take his hand again. If this story moved you, drop a like, share it with someone who loves hidden history, and subscribe for more untold stories from the shadows of power. See you in the next one.